tonight an introduction to James Abbott McNeill Whistler, probably one of the very most important artists of the later part of the 19th century. Is an artist who brings about amusement, controversy. He also introduces new concepts in art, which we'll be exploring. And I've tried, where possible in tonight's talk, to look at his whole life and give you an idea of the history of his life. But also we have the chance to look at certain paintings in a little bit more depth. And because his paintings are not like when I've been looking at other Victorian artists such as Burne-Jones or John Everett Millais, where we might discuss a subject, we very much have to look at Whistler's paintings and understand what he is actually about as an artist. And so we will have to delve a little bit into the concepts behind his work. It's a very interesting life, it's a very full life, and I hope you're going to follow it through, and we have a recording of this, so you can freeze the recording at certain points. I put various dates up on the screen, which will help us as we look at Whistler's life. So I shall begin with my first slide. So I'm going to break it up a little bit. We're going to look at his very early life. For the Russians here, we actually have a Russian element. Whistler spent time in St. Petersburg. He was also a fluent Russian speaker as well. We look at his life back in New England as the West Point Academy. We then look at his progress to Europe, and then his arrival on the English art scene and the Royal Academy of 1860. We look at his interaction with some of the very best knowns in French art in the early 1860s, his contribution to the Salon de Refusés in 1863. We look at the artists who worked and lived around Cheyne Walk in Chelsea. We look at the Bohemian circle of which he moved in. We consider aestheticism in Victorian art, and it's a new emerging way of approach picture making. We look at some of the society portraits and some of the patrons, the famous Ruskin libel trial, but from Whistler's point of view. We look at him going to Venice, and then I look at the 10 o'clock lecture and progress to the end of his life. There are two little photographs I've got here. One, a lovely portrait by Henri Fantin-Latour of Whistler from 1865. So we're looking at Whistler at about 30 years old there. He was a great friend of Fantin-Latour, certainly in the early years. We'll find as I go through this evening that Whistler had great fallings out with almost everybody. So very few people, even people he would consider his bosom buddies and greatest friends, unfortunately very often end up on the wrong side or end up skewered on his very, very sharp tongue. I've included this lovely little quote at the beginning because it's so much to do with the way we must view Whistler's paintings. As music is the poetry of sound, so painting is the poetry of sight, and the subject matter has nothing to do with harmony of sound or of colour. So when we're looking at a Whistler painting, we've got to first enjoy it for what it is and for colour. And even in the early works, when we look at his etchings, we're looking at them for beauty of line and form, rather than necessarily looking for the other deeper meanings that we might have looked for in other types of Victorian painting. So that's a brief timeline, which you'll be able to play back if you do the thing on the YouTube. You can have a look at the actual timeline of Whistler's life. I picked out significant dates, which I would suggest are turning points within his life or important junctions within his life. As you can see, it's a very full life, and it travels. And unusually for a 19th century artist, he has been both sides of both in Europe. He has very, very good connections in Europe, Russia and USA. Although he never returns to the USA after the 1860s. So in fact, although Americans claim him as a great American expatriate artist, he doesn't actually, unlike some of the other American artists actually then travel back to the USA. But I don't claim him as a Victorian artist as such, because his links with, particularly with France, are so wonderful and so much stronger in one sense than so many other so-called Victorian artists. James McNeill Whistler was born in Lowell in Massachusetts. That's just north of Boston, and it's a mill town on the Merrimack River. In his early life, his father was an engineer and a civil engineer employed by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia to construct the great railway between St. Petersburg and Moscow. His father dies when Whistler is very young. His father dies of cholera in St. Petersburg, and the family then return to the USA. In 1851, Whistler enters his father's alma mater at the US Military Academy of West Point in upstate New York, up on the Hudson River. In 1854, Whistler is expelled from West Point. In 1855, he makes experiments with lithography and etching and returns to Europe and France. So that's the early part of his life. All the other points are going to be covered in the lecture, but I thought you would like to see some of those dates to give you just an idea of just what a full life we are examining tonight. In the bottom right-hand corner is one of Whistler's famous little monograms, the butterfly monogram, which appears on so many of his paintings, and it's and depending on how he's feeling, the sharp little point on the end can get even more pointed. So here's Whistler's father up on the left, George Washington Whistler, 1800 to 1849. He marries Anna McNeill Whistler in 1833. Anna McNeill Whistler is in fact George's second wife. James Whistler, who's known affectionately in the family as Jimmy, is the eldest of Anna's offspring. So there are eight children, and it's a big family. George Washington Whistler was probably one of the most successful civil engineers of his age, and he was spotted by the Tsar Nicholas as the ideal person to build this amazing railway. And there is the Nikolaev Railway. There's one of the trains on it, and there's one of the famous bridges that Whistler's father was responsible for constructing. There is a portrait there of Tsar Nicholas I. The railway itself was built between 1842 and 1851, and as we say, Whistler's father died in 1849. And there's a little photograph of the young Jimmy Whistler. He was a precocious child, as we would come to expect. He was fluent in French. Many people in St. Petersburg, as we know, in the 19th century, spoke fluent French and Russian. And Whistler was an exception for an American, that he was trilingual actually, but he coped very well. He did a number of drawing lessons while in St. Petersburg, and he showed peculiar aptitude for working with his pencil. I've also included a little view of his hometown of Lowell in Massachusetts, and that's a place I know reasonably well. Many years in my 30s, I used to go to Lowell quite a bit. It's also the town of Jack Kerouac, for those of you who are into the Beek poets and later manifestations of culture. But Lowell's a working town, and it's a famous mill town, an interesting place. And there's actually a little museum dedicated to Whistler in Lowell in Massachusetts. But suffice it to say, Whistler himself never actually returned to Lowell in later life. And in fact, when the family returned from Russia, they settled in Massachusetts, but not back in Lowell. So Whistler, as I've already explained, although he by the age of 14 desired to be an artist, he enters West Point Military Academy. Now, for somebody who had quite a rebellious spirit, and as we'll find out, someone who did not take authority figures very well. It's amazing that he even lasted as long as he did at West Point. West Point is a rigorous military training in strategy, rather like the American Sandhurst, for those of you from Britain would know of that. But it's on the Hudson River, which is an interesting place. And you may remember last year I talked about some of the painters of the Hudson River School in the 19th century, round about the time Whistler actually joined West Point. In fact, Asher Brown Durand was painting his kindred spirits at the very time that Whistler was in fact at the military academy, as well as Albert Bierstadt with his views of the Hudson. And Hudson River was becoming very, very important for artists. Not that Whistler makes any comments about these artists or the artists of his own land at the time, but he does like to draw quite well, and he also makes some rather cruel cartoons of some of the officers at West Point. Well, there's one little anecdote here, which I'll just read out to you. One day, he plunged over his horse's head, bringing a retort from a military instructor. "Mr. Whistler, I'm pleased to see that for once you're ahead of your class." His aversion to a military authority led to his expulsion, and in fact, he was actually dismissed from the West Point. But he was a young man of great skill. He also had some money from his father's estate, and in a sense he had some means all through his early life, right up into his early 30s. Although Whistler would spend money rather like water. You know, he would go through money, as we'll find out later in life, a considerable amounts of money because he liked to live the high life. Anyway, he joins this survey in Washington, where he learns to make. He's employed as a draftsman, which he's started to learn technical draftsmanship while at West Point, and he enjoys a short while between 1854 and 1855 as part of this survey. And if you look at that little illustration at the top right-hand corner, an example of Whistler's geographical illustrations. But as you can see in the top left-hand corner of that illustration, he's also done some nice, neat little figures and things which have got nothing to do with it whatsoever. And again, it's a sign of Whistler's a rebellious spirit and insubordination. So he leaves the survey, and by now he is determined to become an artist. And he travels back to the old world, to Europe, where France is really the place where he believes will be a great place for him and to develop as an artist. So he arrives in Paris. Now Whistler has an absolute, it's almost like a homing spirit towards the shakers and movers of his time. It's an uncanny thing about Whistler. He is attracted to the very centers of each world that he comes across, and so he is always at the very center of it. And so he moves into the circle, particularly of Fantin-Latour, and through him to Gustave Courbet, the leading realist artist of the period, the greatest artist in one sense outside of the Salon, Gustave Courbet, Alphonse Legros, and through him he meets also Manet and the very, very important critic Charles Baudelaire. And Baudelaire, of course, is in his criticism very, very important to development of French realist painting and ultimately French impressionism, in that art should be connected to real life and should not be illustrations of mythological scenes or religious scenes, but it should be for the stuff of life. And this, to some extent, accords with Whistler's own spirit. And he forms a little group with Fantin-Latour and Legros, and they form this group, and they are the three. And at this time, in 1857, 1858, produce the first of these rather lovely etchings. And as you can see, Whistler's already pretty accomplished in an etching technique, which he is an absolute master at. Often you might think of Whistler as just as a painter of these washes of lovely colours and receding and misty landscapes, but no, he is a master etcher and also a very good draftsman. Bear in mind that these etchings are very, very small scale too, some of them no bigger than maybe your iPhone. It gives you an idea of the scale. There's an early self-portrait by Whistler in a hat, shows great debt to Gustave Courbet in its rich use of impasto and dark Dutch colour. But we can certainly see he's a very confident man, is Whistler. He shows a great deal of swagger and confidence. Whistler is always a natty dresser. He's very, very concerned about his appearance, and he is very, very sharp with his tongue, as we shall find out. Charles Glare, the Swiss painter, also was involved, shall we say. Whistler entered his atelier for a short period and learnt the rudiments of oil painting with Glare. The style itself didn't rub off on Whistler at all. Glare's paintings are very conventional Salon paintings. But as we know, in Paris at the time, most artists apprenticed to a Salon painter to gain technical skills, and Whistler achieved some of that, but I think he learned a lot more from Fantin-Latour and Courbet, and that is evidenced by his early paintings. So let's just move on. Now this etching here, The Unsafe Tenement from 1858, is really one of his early, most accomplished etchings, and this was part of the series of the 12 etchings from nature done in France, and it certainly shows a great deal of competence as an etcher. What Whistler hadn't mastered quite at this stage, with actually, because when you're working on an etching plate, everything is in reverse. He wasn't so good at actually writing his signature in reverse, so there is a little bit of often the S's are around the wrong way and things like that on the early Whistler etchings, but they have an endearing quality. Also, there is a slight figurative element in this one too. Whistler's etchings were very much influenced by the collection of his brother-in-law, Francis Seymour Hayden, who was a great etcher himself, and also had a great collection of Rembrandt's etchings, an example of which is in the bottom right-hand corner, landscape with a square tower. And we can see a lot of Rembrandt's influence in Whistler's early etched work. And there's also an example of a Seymour Hayden etching back in Britain, the Yacht Tavern at Erith. And now we can see from this, when we look at the Whistler Thames etchings, how similar they are to Hayden's. And it's through Hayden that he sets up his own etching press when he comes to London. And in London, it's where Whistler first really establishes himself as an artist of note, and particularly a very, very strong artist. Now he, again, he's an outsider, and it's because of in being an outsider that he very often is attracted to subjects that are sort of passed over by mainstream Victorian artists. And that's probably what makes his paintings so interesting. So he gravitates towards the River Thames, and he paints the people, particularly in the Angel pub at Rotherhithe. He paints the boats, the bargemen, and the riverside traffic of the River Thames, and he does this wonderfully. So those are two examples of his early paintings, but he is at the same time producing a fine series of etchings. And these are some of the fine ones that are from 1859. And as we can see already, there are some distinctive Whistlerian qualities. He he doesn't delineate everything. He's always able to use blank spaces, and this is something artistically that happens in his work, even in his paintings, and develops more and more. We have the idea of a receding composition. So you have the divisions and spatial relationships within the etching are particularly well chosen. But that Black Lion Wharf is a very good example of a Whistler etching from his early Thames series, as is the sweeping perspective of Millbank from 1861. So these are fine etchings, and even if Whistler had never become a painter, he would be probably known as a master etcher. And it was fortuitous that he was doing etching, because etching had become a rather debased sort of form of art. Ruskin was highly critical of people who used etching. He preferred the mezzotint and lithography, mainly because he saw printmaking as an ideal medium for reproduction, particularly of plates of the works of Turner and some of the favoured artists of the period. But Whistler joins this junior etching club, and it is at the junior etching club that he comes into contact with some of the other most important artists in England at the time, including John Everett Millais and Richard Redgrave particularly. And Millais has taken up a little bit of etching. As you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see that he's done a take upon his apple blossom spring there. And you can see it's reversed again if you work in etching. Now, Whistler had unsuccessfully submitted his At the Piano, the painting of 1859, to the Salon, where it had been rejected. However, we find with Whistler, he never says die. He continues doggedly with things until they work. And it was this painting, At the Piano, was successfully exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1860, and it was noted upon by very, very many people because it was a very fresh piece of painting, much more broadly painted than most Victorian paintings, and it already displays Whistler's bold approach to painting and aestheticism, the lovely deep blacks against white, against the lovely lush greens and greys, the picture framing that we see later on in paintings like the painting of his mother. These are strong paintings, and this particular painting was noted by his fellow etching club member, John Everett Millais, as a very fine piece of painting. Millais was rather critical of his drafts of Whistler's draftsmanship, but he certainly recognised in Whistler a great colourist. And many of the more astute Victorian artists recognised that a great figure had come upon the scene. Whistler finally got actually this painting, At the Piano, back into an exhibition at the Paris Salon in 1867. So this painting is seen as really a manifesto work and an early and an important work. But we see already that he's breaking away from the Courbet influence, and we're getting much more the influence of the young Edgar Degas particularly, and certainly of Fantin-Latour. We've got a lot of that in this particular painting. But I suppose the first painting that really of great note by Whistler, and one that we probably many of us would know, is Symphony in White No. 1, The White Girl, painted at the same time as Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White. The painting depicts Jo, Whistler's girlfriend at the time. The sort of lost expression, the dreaminess of it is a nod in the direction of Millais' Autumn Leaves, and yet it is something, being life-size, it is something quite different and something very, very bold. It was too bold for the Royal Academy of 1862, where it was rejected. But it's a painting that already shows Whistler's interest in a painting for beauty for its own right, and and dealing with subtle relationships of tone, and looking at something that doesn't need a narrative in the way that so many Victorian paintings are almost bursting with symbolism and narrative. Whistler's painting is very, very modern painting. And he repeats this again in Symphony in White No. 2, The Little White Girl of 1864. This painting's in Tate Britain, and here we have two elements for the first time in Whistler's work that are really emblematic and point the way forward for the way his work is going to develop. Note the Japanese fan in the hand of the woman. Also the azaleas mimicking Hokusai's woodblock prints, which have become very, very fashionable in early Victorian England by the 1860s, with Japan opening up, and there were many, many woodblock prints available in London and in Paris, and they were a mark of the new aesthetic movement. Also on the shelf, we notice a lovely piece of porcelain, which is again a passion of Whistler. Whistler collected porcelain and Japanese prints, and anything to do with Japan or China at the time was very, very important to Whistler. Also the idea of the reflection, which if we think of Edouard Manet a little bit later with his Bar at the Folies Bergère, Whistler steals a march upon that. This painting is 1864, so he's quite a bit before Manet in the idea of using the idea of the reflected image in this particular way. Of course, the mirror had been used in a number of Victorian paintings like Augustus Egg and William Holman Hunt, but not in this particular way, and they're fascinating works. Also, Whistler favoured these simple frames too, not these Rococo or Baroque frames. So already he was looking for this sort of Japanese Oriental simplicity about his work. Move on. Okay. Anyway, Whistler paints. There's a lovely little painting in the middle there of his Joanna Heffernan, who was an Irish woman, and she was his partner for a while. And she is painted there in a sketch of 1861. Now, Whistler always had itchy feet, and he goes off to Chile, and he leaves Joe in charge of his money while he is gone. Unfortunately, she is in Paris at the same time as Gustave Courbet, and it is quite likely that Courbet had an affair with Joe whilst Whistler was away. And she is immortalized in a number of Courbet's quite racy paintings of this particular period. And any of you who have been to the Musée d'Orsay will know what I'm talking about. Courbet was also painting, had previously painted Young Ladies on the Banks of the Seine from 1857. Again, quite a shocking painting, what it would be ultra shocking in Britain, but in Paris this was still quite shocking to see ladies in their undergarments on the boards of the Seine. But in fact, he painted Joe in the nude as well, and there were quite a number of scandalous paintings connected to Whistler's partner at the time. And it was at this time too that Whistler also, I think, makes something of a break with Courbet, not just because of this situation, but he is in fact far more enthusiastic about the possibilities of art in Britain than he is in fact in France, which is quite interesting. He certainly sees an opening for his work in Britain in the way that he doesn't quite see in France, but he doesn't break any ties with France, far from it. So if we look at it in a European context, Whistler's Symphony in White No. 1 from 1862, which is in fact shown at the Salon de Refusés in 1863. And we can see other artists of the same period. I pick out Millet's Somnambulist, which is a direct, almost like a pastiche of Whistler's Symphony in White. The artists are playing against each other in that. Edouard Manet paints Woman with a Parrot, again of a very famous Parisian model. Similar ideas going on there. We can see in Millet's portrait of Nina Lehmann, again, this look, which sort of is captured in Joe's expression in Symphony in White No. 1. And of course, it was the period, as illustrated in Punch in my little illustration of 1862 there. The white girl, or the woman in white, was the enormously influential and popular Wilkie Collins novel and ghost story. So it was all the rage at the time, and Whistler can play upon that, and it's all part of the scene. And so we come to 1863, and under Napoleon III, so many artists were not getting into the official Salon, and many artists of great quality were having their works rejected. And so this building here, the Industrial Arts Building in Paris, was opened for the Salon de Refusés, and one of the most important exhibitions of the Salon de Refusés was in 1863, when we had Manet's very important painting, Déjeuner sur l'herbe, a painting of which had classical allusions, but also was shocking because it depicted a modern picnickers with a nude woman having a picnic with clothed men, which was absolutely scandalous. And Whistler showed his Symphony in White at the same exhibition. So this exhibition was really throwing down a gauntlet to the establishment, and two artists who were in the vanguard of that were particularly Edouard Manet and James McNeill Whistler. And Whistler certainly relished the opportunity to be this outsider, this American who would show Paris a new type of painting and a new radical way of painting. And this is actually before French Impressionism fully develops. So Whistler is a very bold artist, and we never mistake that away from him. In 1862, this is a very bold move. Whistler is already drawing analogies with his work with the ideas of music and painting, and also resolutely pulling away from the idea of a painting having a subject matter, which was so important to the Royal Academy and to the Salon of the day. And Whistler also, around this time in 1865, back in London, paints himself in a studio. And this is a very radical painting, in the same way that Courbet had 10 years before depicted his own life in his studio in France. His famous painting, The Artist's Studio, which summed up Courbet's world, that is the world of the French populace and the working poor around the village of Ornans, and the nude model standing behind him. That summed up Courbet's life. Whistler's life was one of great sophistication, surrounded by pieces of wonderful porcelain, Japanese fans, mirrors, and notice Whistler, ever the dandy, wearing wonderful suits to paint in, and he poses brilliantly all the time. And any photograph you see of Whistler, he is always immaculately posed, and he is very much aware of the celebrity of the artist. It's very important to Whistler to appear. It's intensely modern, and it's something that really has emerged, and he is in the vanguard of that. So he's a very modern man in many ways, and of course he draws an awful lot of criticism because he is so different to so many other Victorian artists. And he sets up in Lindsay Row, which becomes Cheyne Walk, which is the center really of a Bohemian circle. And Cheyne Walk, of course, had Rossetti's studio. Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the great pre-Raphaelite painter, now had a studio on Cheyne Walk. Those of you who know much about Rossetti had a group, had many animals within the grounds of his house. He was, of course, a notable eccentric Bohemian, would hold great soirees and artists' meetings at his home. Whistler likewise too, at 96 Cheyne Walk, also held gatherings together, which we'll just have a look at. This is a little photograph on the left-hand corner there, shows an interior at Cheyne Walk. Whistler already connecting a lot of Japanese pottery, and also he collects a painting by Millet called Awake, which is also about white on white. And Millet, as I say, at this particular period is playing a game almost with Whistler, showing, and his paintings very often correctives to Whistler as well, in that Millet is talking about the volume of paint, whereas Whistler looks at the flatness of the surface. And there's a lovely painting by Millet of the sisters. And then later on we have the Renoir painting of the girl with the hoop and the white and the blue sash. So we have all these influences happening. Now Cheyne Walk looked out onto the mud flats just by Battersea Bridge. It was just outside of London at the time, but it was a very, very Bohemian area. Whistler, at the end of his life, dies at 74 Cheyne Walk in 1903. But before then, he also lives at the White House at Tite Street, designed by Goodwin. Now, Whistler was known not for soirees so much as for Sunday breakfasts. And he would send one of these invitations, as you've got here, to a 12 p.m. Sunday breakfast, where Whistler himself would cook buckwheat pancakes. He would serve coffee, and he would lots of shellfish, and there would be an enormous spread. And he would, but he had these breakfasts where he would invite very often the up-and-coming moneyed middle classes who were looking to buy paintings. Bohemian circle and radical artists would come to be amused, to be educated. Whistler would desperately try to sell work, and he would also try to shock people. And it was at these breakfasts that he would very often undermine other artists, and he would say things just to shock people. And in the middle of the table was a goldfish bowl. And these were legendary times, really. But all throughout his life, he held these breakfasts, and he actually did make these. The buckwheat pancakes were something he had learnt from his mother when they had lived in St. Petersburg, and he continued to do that, and that was his sort of hallmark recipe, really. And the coffee was a very important part, which was sort of interesting because coffee wasn't necessarily something that was usual for English people to drink at the time at a breakfast, or indeed at all. So that was interesting. And of course we have with the Matthew Perry's great expedition to Tokyo in 1853. The Orient was opening up, and the Japanese world was opening up, and Japanese pottery and prints and fans and the kimonos were coming over in their crate load to London. And there's a little print from the Japanese point of view of the Perry first contact. But by the time Whistler was living in London, Japanese art was all the rage, as it was in Paris, of course, too. And it enters into even conventional painters like Millet in Miss Davidson. You can see a little Japanese fan in the corner. And Whistler was always making references to the art of Japan within his early works, and it was a profound influence upon his aesthetics. He loved the simplicity of Japan and Oriental art, and he was an enormous collector of pottery, and anything to do with Japan was important to him. And of course he celebrated it in his own paintings. And this painting here, Caprice in purple and gold, painted in 1864, a remarkably modern painting really for its date, with the golden screen behind it, shows a young woman in a kimono examining Japanese prints. And Whistler also, like a number of other Victorian artists, was very interested in the frame too. So he would design the frames as well, going with his paintings. Other artists, of course, were equally influenced by the art of Japan. Millet's Hearts of Trumps has a number of pieces of Japanese and Oriental furniture, and the Chinese screen behind it, and the azaleas behind the Armstrong sisters. James Tissot, in his painting The Japanese Scroll, also shows another approach in Victorian England to a Japanese art and life. And we enter a period of aestheticism. So that is many paintings that ostensibly had a classical or mythological subject, but really deep down were to do with the beauty of colour and feminine beauty. And Whistler, of course, took this to absolute extremes. When it was a Lord Leighton, it had to be dressed up in a classical myth, like Leda and the Swan, or in the Millet painting of Esther from the Bible, or we had Albert Moore as The Summer Heat. We had Frederick Sand's paintings, which allude to a classical sculpture. But Whistler would have none of that. His paintings were just a beautiful women in kimonos, and he did not wish to have anything other than musical titles for his work, so he didn't want to dress things up in a classical guise or a mythological world, as so many Victorian painters did. But we can see there is a correspondence in the type of paintings that are painted by other Victorian artists to Whistler's work, but Whistler always has his own take upon it, and he's his own person. And he has a very sharp tongue. So whilst he meets with some of the movers and shakers of the period, particularly Dante Gabriel Rossetti, equally a Bohemian to Whistler in many ways, but he meets with Charles Dickens' daughter Kate Berrettini, and Valentine Prinsep, also, who had worked on the Oxford Union murals, and the poet Algernon Swinburne as well, were all part of this circle in Cheyne Walk. And there's a lovely little limerick by Rossetti there. There's a combative artist named Whistler, who is like his own hog hairs a bristler, a tube of white lead and a punch on the head offer varied attractions to Whistler. And that's some, they got on okay, did Rossetti and Whistler. I think they knew the measure of each other. They both recognized each other's genius. And but this is the milieu of Cheyne Walk, really. This is a wonderful era. And Whistler too is working in pastel. He's doing these very, very bold pictures for the period. I mean, this is 1869, 1868. If you look at a Valentine Prinsep painting of the Golden Gate of a similar period, and you just see how modern Whistler really is. He's very, very loose in the way he paints, uses sgraffito with his end of his brush cutting into the paint, and he calls things symphonies or arrangements or nocturnes. He's using musical titles for his works. Now, Whistler befriends a boatman on the shore just by Cheyne Walk, Walter Graves, who himself becomes an artist. And Walter Graves' father had been the boatman for Turner, and so had been involved with artists all through his life. And Turner had employed Graves' father as the boatman for many of his Thames scenes. But Walter Graves, in fact, is the boatman for Whistler, and so enables Whistler to get some very, very fine views underneath the old Battersea Bridge. And there is a Walter Graves painting of the old Battersea Bridge. Now, Battersea Bridge at that time wasn't the stone bridge of today, but it looked very much like a Japanese footbridge. And of course, that was really attractive to Whistler because it was a bit of Japan right on his doorstep, and Whistler made the most of that. And so he depicts the Battersea Bridge really as if it was somewhere in Hokkaido or somewhere like that. It was to him a great gift. He fell out later on in life with Graves, but there was a golden period when Graves certainly was absolutely in Whistler's thrall, and Whistler owes a lot really to Graves in the fact that he managed to get out on the river and actually see some of these wonderful places. Now, I would say that the River Thames at this period was not the lovely river where you can catch fish in today. As many of you will know, in 1858, my little note at the bottom there was a thing known as the Great Stink. Basically, the River Thames was an open sewer, and caused many outbreaks of cholera and a great deal of sickness. It was almost impossible to live in some parts of London because of the asphyxiating smell from the river, and those little cartoons from Punch just sum that up. Fortunately, the great engineer Joseph Bazalgette was employed during Whistler's lifetime a little bit later in the 1870s, and they cleared up a lot of the awful sewage problems and enabled Victorian London to have the fine sewage system that it does even today. Such was Bazalgette's skill, and hopefully we'll look at his life at some point. But Whistler, if we think of these paintings that are painted on the shoreline of the Thames, we think that he did sketch them when from the real places, Whistler must have had a fine constitution. Also, it's rather unusual because his own father had died of cholera, so you would have thought he might have wanted to avoid the river and anything to do with cholera. But Whistler, if nothing is not perverse, and he paints the Thames side scenes such as this. And you can see the Thames was a filthy place. I mean, even James Tissot shows these society people on the back of a little launch in the Pool of London there, and you can see if the effluent within the water didn't get you, it would be the smoke from the billowing chimneys of the steamships that would. So we come to the principal point of Whistler's art, really, which is the whole notion of art for art's sake. And I've already talked very much about this, that Whistler's art is not about subject matter, but it was a radical departure from what else is known in Victorian England in a way. Early ideas about art for art's sake emerge even in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And he talks about art not having a purpose in some ways. Later, we find during Whistler's lifetime, Walter Pater expounds the whole idea of aestheticism and art for art's sake. Notably, as we'll see, Oscar Wilde talking about life imitating art far more than art imitating life. And from France, of course, Gautier's theories are very much a part of this emerging the idea that art should exist just for its own sake. It doesn't have to be the servant of religion or philosophy or anything else. It can be for beauty alone. But of course, in Victorian England, that's pitted against the very, very hard established views, which are particularly formed under, particularly John Ruskin, Matthew Arnold, to some extent William Hazlitt, the whole idea that art has to have a moral purpose and a meaning for the improvement of society, and art that did not have some sort of moral behind it, or indeed didn't have some connection with human improvement, was to be highly suspicious, and art should always have some communicate some higher ideal or some higher purpose. And of course, this eventually, the denouement of this is of course the Ruskin trial of 1878. But Whistler too is unusual too in he draws up this whole idea of the parallels between visual art and music, and it's something that we take for granted today, but it was quite novel in Whistler's time, really. And so he's looking at the Nocturnes of Chopin. He's thinking about this period about the idea of pieces of music and different keys of music, as in music you have music in C minor key, like an A minor or an E minor, has a sadder feel to it, and a major key has a bolder color. So Whistler too plays the painter's palette rather like a piano keyboard, and he makes all these parallels in many of his pamphlets. He talks about the idea that music and art are connected in this way, and they affect the soul, and this is a very, very important part of what he is trying to communicate with his work. And so music and visual art are very, very interconnected. And this is a good 50 years before Vasily Kandinsky draws these parallels, or Paul Klee in the 20th century. So Whistler's an innovative artist in that respect. And this is one of his well, shall we say, early period paintings, this Nocturne in blue and gold, 1872 to 75. And it really is a remarkable piece of painting for its date. It's at the Tate Britain, and as we can see, it depicts Old Battersea Bridge very much as a Japanese bridge with the fireworks falling behind. Very loosely painted. This is not your typical Victorian painting by any means. It's painted so you can barely see where one brushstroke ends into another. It's with lots of there's pastel sort of treatment of colour, and it doesn't have a defined edges, and it invokes an impression. It's a type of impressionism very different to that of, shall we say, Claude Monet's impressionism or Camille Pissarro's impressionism. Now, by this time, by 1866, Whistler was doing quite well, and he moved into the White House, and this is the house itself in Tite Street, just a little bit up from Cheyne Walk. And Whistler lives here until 1878, and he has a big studio here, and it's designed by E.W. Goodwin, who's a well-known architect of the period. And Whistler has quite a bit of input into the actual design of the house as well. And of course, the studio and where he lived was very important to him for his Sunday breakfasts as well, because he was, if nothing, not the social hub of the area, really. Later on in Tite Street, of course, John Singer Sargent moves further up that road as well. There's another lovely examples of Whistler's work from this period: variations in pink and grey, a nocturne in blue and silver, and the Cremorne lights, Cremorne Gardens in the background. But notice how simple they are, how affected by Japanese design these paintings are, and how that they're just meditative works. We should enjoy them just for the colour, really, just for their beauty. And Whistler often said that paint should not be applied thick. It should be like a breath on the surface of a pane of glass. And in a way, he's echoing something that we see in some of Turner's late works. If we think of Turner's great painting, The Evening Star, it's painted in a very similar manner. Of course, Ruskin lauded Turner's work, but he couldn't stand what Whistler was doing, as we know. But this is a great example. This one on the left is a great example of Whistler's painting technique. You can just see how these very, very wispy-like washes of colour are applied, and the minimal composition too, which just echoes Japanese prints. As to these sketches too, very, very modern for their time, all of them based on Japanese prints and women in kimonos, loosely painted, and they're just done for the beauty of their colour, the azaleas, the kimonos, and Whistler also employing Japanese lanterns and fans, and they were all the rage. And we think of John Singer Sargent at a later stage. He paints people with Japanese fans and lanterns. So it's all part of this world. And Whistler's associate, Albert Joseph Moore, the one who actually spoke up for him at the trial, as an example of his paintings. Of course, his ones are slightly harder edge and much more conscious of artists like Leighton, but they're still great pieces of aesthetic painting. Well, Whistler, of course, is always needling other artists. I mean, you know, he's so different to so many other Victorian painters who are so polite to one another. Even if they can't stand one another, they're very polite and very British. Of course, Whistler being American, he doesn't have to be like that. And so when invited to one of Leighton's soirees, it was overheard, "My dear Whistler, you leave your pictures in such a sketchy, unfinished state. Why don't you finish them?" says Frederick Leighton to Whistler. And Whistler says, "My dear Leighton, why do you ever begin yours?" So Whistler is just needling the Lord Leighton, or well, he wasn't Lord Leighton then, but Leighton at the time, just almost taking the mick out of Lord Leighton and the titles that he called his pictures and the classical allusions. And Whistler's paintings were none of that. And he even makes the comment at one time, "Paints too, doesn't he?" So he's quite, he really gets under different artists' skin in such a way. Of course, Leighton was part of the Holland Park area of artists, and Whistler was down by the riverbank. So there was a sort of rivalry between those two groups of artists, although some covalency with Valentine Prinsep and Marcus Stone. And Whistler, this lovely comment by Oscar Wilde, as for borrowing Mr. Whistler's ideas about, right, the only thoroughly original ideas I've heard him express have been reference to his own superiority as a painter over painters greater than himself. And all the time he was talking about himself in very boastful terms, possibly slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I think he really believed he was the greatest artist, and he would talk about it, and he certainly sell himself that way. Well, he comes into the orbit of a great shipping magnate, Leyland, Frederick Richards Leyland, who is looking first off for wonderful portraits of himself and his wife. This wonderful painting here in New York City, as I've seen. There's Whistler's very handsome portrait of him. An interesting painting. Leyland actually has his wife's dress held over his arm, and also holding a Japanese a fan within his left hand, and his top hat in the other hand. I noticed the emblematic Whistler monogram on one side. But Whistler gets in with Leyland in quite a big way. Rossetti has also done Leyland's portrait as well, and Leyland commissions this marvelous work for his Knightsbridge home, which is the Peacock Room. Now, Leyland had already had the Peacock Room completely decorated by an interior designer called Jekyll the year before. But Whistler takes it on and takes it to a new level. The whole room is now actually transported to Washington, and you can actually go to this room. It's a wonderful place. If you can go to the Free Art Gallery in Washington, do walk into this room. We can see Whistler's painting, The Princess from the Land of Porcelain at the end, various examples of Oriental porcelain all the way around the walls, these wonderful golden screens covering the windows. It's a marvelous piece. Whistler put in an invoice for £2,000, which, let me tell you, that's millions in today's terms. After when Leyland came back, he was sort of balked at this, and they fell out. And so Whistler had this design at the other end of the room of two peacocks sparring, peacocks, the great symbols of the aesthetic movement, and dancing over little coins, over pieces of money. And Whistler was always, I mean, he just couldn't help himself when even his patrons he would needle. But it is one of the fine rooms of the late 19th century, and I like it every bit as much as Leighton House's Arab Hall. And this is Whistler's retort to Leyland once Leyland comes back, and he's absolutely aghast that he's got to pay £2,000 for this. I have made you famous. My work will still live when you're forgotten. Still, perchance, in the dim ages to come, you will be remembered as the proprietor of the Peacock Room. And the Peacock Room was this great masterpiece. And but of course, it caused poor Thomas Jekyll, who had designed the room for Leyland the year before, to have a breakdown, and eventually led to his early death. So there are all these background stories, and there's so many of these with Whistler, and taking people to court and criticizing people. It goes on all the time with Whistler. You cannot rest easy with James McNeill Whistler. But he seems to get on all right with the historian Carlyle, also a resident of Cheyne Walk. And he paints this marvelous portrait called Arrangement in Grey and Black. Coming towards the end of Thomas Carlyle's life, he paints this, the historian, philosopher, sitting in his chair here, a similar position to that, the portrait of Whistler's mother, similar ilk, and you can see the famous butterfly symbol on the wall, very Japanese in its composition. We can see Alphonse Levagos painting of Thomas Carlyle, much more conventional. The very strong Millet portrait painted 5 years later, just before Carlyle died, and it was unfinished. That's in the National Portrait Gallery, which is a wonderful study of the head by Millet. But the Carlyle by Whistler is one of those great paintings from the Victorian era, and really does sum up the world weariness of the man, and so much about him. And it's so original in the way it's painted. And we come to probably the most famous painting that Whistler ever painted, and that was the arrangement in grey and black, #1, Whistler's Mother, painted in 1871. So he's coming into the full powers. In the background is a print, one of the early etchings from the River Thames in the background. And he uses this, again, when he was asked why he was born in Lowell, he said, the explanation is quite simple. I wish to be near my mother. That's how he explained his birth in America. But he also, his mother comes over to live in London, which causes some consternation because Whistler, carrying on this Bohemian lifestyle, is still rather fearful of his deeply Protestant mother, who is very disapproving of any Bohemian sort of lifestyle. His partner has to move out of the house and all of that at the time, but she also spends her last years in the house, and Whistler paints this marvelous portrait of her, which at the Musée d'Orsay is one of the attractions of that museum. And it's a peculiarly brilliant painting. Actually, it employs all the things that are important about Whistler: Oriental design, simplicity, modulated colour, and also an insightful portrait which echoes the great portraits by Rembrandt of his own mother. John Everett Millais does a corrective of the painting in his portrait of Mrs. Hugh the following year. And for Millais, his criticism of Whistler was that he didn't add volume to his work. And so in Mrs. Hugh's portrait, Millais does a corrective, again painting an elderly woman, but deliberately echoing the Whistler portrait. And there we are. Whistler is, of course, his own person by the mid-1870s, and he says a picture is finished when all traces of the means used to bring it about to the end has disappeared. So not for him any bravura marks, brush marks, or anything like that. Everything has to be almost worked away, so it's like a dream, or it's in a mist or a haze. Great example is this one, Nocturne, Trafalgar Square, Chelsea snow. It's just all about mood. And his arrangements in black, this portrait of Mrs. Lewis Huth, deliberately reminiscent of the great Spanish portraits of Diego Velázquez, but also beautifully arranged, rather like a Japanese print too. Now Whistler is within sight of this Cremorne Gardens. Now these are like a pleasure gardens in just outside quite near Battersea, and they were set up in the early in the mid 1840s by actually a person who was in fact a fraudster called Charles Random. But that aside, that was very often where great hot air balloons were released from, and there were firework displays every night. Now Cremorne Gardens were very interesting to Whistler because they were a place where he could observe fireworks falling, and he could paint society as it went about its business. And that's a lovely little painting of Cremorne Gardens in the top right there. Much better than perhaps the painting by Levin from 1864. It shows you a traditional painting by Phoebus Levin from 1864. There's a Whistler painting from the mid-1870s. You would see just how advanced the Whistler painting is upon the traditional Victorian painting of the gardens. But it was the gardens which brings about this great painting, Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket of 1875, which is exhibited at the new Grosvenor Gallery in 1877. Sir Coutts Lindsay had set up this gallery in New Bond Street, really rather like Salon de Refusés, that it was in a place where artists who couldn't get their work into the Royal Academy or had excess work from the Royal Academy could show their work in new, well-lit galleries for a very, very picture-hungry public. And so Whistler exhibits some of his studies of the Thames, and also this Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket. Now, John Ruskin enters the Grosvenor Gallery. He makes notes on all the paintings as he goes around the Grosvenor Gallery, and he he happens upon Nocturne, Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket. He had been aware of Whistler right up to this point, but here comes the point where Ruskin is really very very harsh about Whistler, to such an extent that Whistler bites back and takes John Ruskin to court. And so we have the famous Ruskin trial of 1878. Now, Ruskin was too ill to attend the trial itself, so he is represented by John Holker QC. And there are many monographs upon this particular trial, which is a fulcrum point, really, in the history of modern art, in the fact that we see the breakup, really, of the grip that Ruskin has upon the art world, and the new aesthetic movement emerging, really, into a dominant place. And of course, we have the final retort was, if 2 days' labour was worth 200 guineas, no, Whistler responded, I ask it for the knowledge I have gained in the work of a lifetime. And of course, Whistler too suggested art should be independent of all claptrap and should stand alone and appeal to the artistic sense of eye or ear. And so with this, the final judgment from the trial, Whistler is awarded 1 farthing in damages. But of course, the court costs are absolutely crippling, and it bankrupts James McNeill Whistler. It has been suggested, really, up to the point of the trial, Whistler was spending money at the White House like it was going out of fashion. I mean, he was holding parties, he was holding these breakfasts, he spent a whole year on Peacock Room, with he was wasting a lot of money. He wore the finest clothes. He would travel. He was hardly somebody who was putting money in a bank. Was James McNeill Whistler? So he goes bankrupt following the trial, and the bankruptcy sale of 1879 means that all of these things, as you can see in the poster, are put up for sale. All of his collection of Japanese art and all the pottery, all his own paintings and the house, all put up for sale, and Whistler is bankrupt. However, riding to his salvation, in a sense, was Marcus Hewish of the newly set up Fine Art Society. Also in New Bond Street, right near the Grosvenor Gallery, is the Fine Art Society. Maybe some of you know it. And the gallery is one of the first galleries which actually produced exhibitions with good catalogues with essays by Ruskin and Frederick George Stevens and other writers of the period, and also majored on single exhibitions of artists, particularly portfolios of prints, and they've continued to do this right up to today. And so the Fine Arts Society commissioned Whistler to go back to do some etchings and go to Venice. And well, I think for Whistler, with the Ruskin trial and everything like that, he goes to Venice, and of course, who could say Venice is a bad place to visit as an artist? And so he goes to Venice, and he makes some of the most remarkable work of his later career. And he goes back to etching, and he produces a series of etchings of Venice, which are some of the most beautiful etchings of the 19th century. And he again uses space in a very inventive way. He also works on etching plates using the he doesn't burnish the plates in places, so the ink itself forms washes of sort of grey and tone underneath him, and they are remarkable sets of prints. And this prints didn't come. He spent a whole year in Venice producing these things and some paintings and having a very good time in Venice. But he comes back with lots of pastels and paintings. Venice seems to be a place of renewal for so many artists, as it is for Claude Monet, for Walter Sickert, and obviously for the great Joseph Turner. So Venice is always rewarding for artists. And this set from 1879 really is a great point in Whistler's life, and in one sense he never does as great work again as the Venetian work. But we have this wonderful set of Venetian etchings, which come back to London, and let's just move that one on. But at the same time, he is quite diverse in the type of paintings he does. I mean, he is very well aware of what is going on in Paris. From just a few years before, he painted this Harmony in Yellow and Gold, 1876-77. Now, if you look at paintings by Renoir of the same period, and paintings by Tissot and Toulouse-Lautrec, all of them are painting the circus and this type of thing. And so Whistler is nothing if not an international artist. He's not like so many Victorians just talking to Victorian society. He is really at the cutting edge of the art world. And it is in the early 1880s, on his return to London, that he really, him and Oscar Wilde begin a period, shall we say, like no other. Wilde, of course, is one of the great wits, the great playwright of the era, and a figure himself that we hopefully in this group we're going to examine. But there are so many to's and fro's between these two, and in fact Oscar Wilde learns a lot of his repartee from the older Whistler. So Wilde would say, when you and I are together, we never talk about anything except ourselves. No, Oscar, you forget. When you and I are together, we never talk about anything except me. And Whistler went on to then slightly, it wasn't jealous of Oscar Wilde, but he slightly, when Oscar Wilde goes on his tour of the USA, Whistler starts to then slightly attack Oscar Wilde, and there's this kind of cooling off. And he believes that Wilde is sort of vulgarizing the notions of aesthetics, there is this sort of interplay between the two anyway, and they're often depicted together in magazines of the period and lumped together in such a way. And there are exchanges at the artist Louise Joplin's studio that have been recorded. And I wish I had said that. I said Oscar Wilde, and you will, Oscar, you will, as Whistler said. And then the American artist John Merritt Chase paints this portrait of Whistler, which Whistler is absolutely outraged by, and he calls it a monstrous lampoon. So Whistler is an artist who is not afraid to attack other artists. He didn't bother what he would say about other people, and falls out with almost everybody at one point or another. And now in 1888, we have another interesting twist in Whistler's life. Really, it's taken 10 years, but this evening, the 10 o'clock, he hires the Piccadilly Hall, that is the old Watercolour Society Hall in Piccadilly, for an evening attended by 600 guests in the theatre. And Whistler, he comes onto the stage, and as it's described here, it says, a man in immaculate evening dress stepped onto the stage of the Prince's Hall, Piccadilly. He places a glossy opera hat on the table, set down his walking cane, and adjusted his eyeglass. Whistler appeared in the footlights like a figure from one of his own canvases, an arrangement in black and silver. It is with great hesitation and as much misgiving, he began, that I appear before you the character of the preacher. And in the following hour, James McNeill Whistler delivers a lecture which is really his philosophy on art, and a riposte to all of those naysayers to his art, and an answering back to John Ruskin in a way. And it was a resounding success. Many people who hadn't taken Whistler quite seriously up to this point, after the 10 o'clock, which is again another very important point in Whistler's life, now began to realise that his art and the role of the artist was one not also just to paint pictures, but something very, very modern, rather like in our own times, like Grayson Peary did the Wreath lectures. It's a similar thing. It's the idea of the artist stepping away from the easel for a while and really talking about art and what it means. And of course, with Whistler, it had many paradoxes, it had many witticisms, epigrams, and of course there was always a sting in the tail with Whistler. He was always pushing back against other people and people who had done him wrong, as he saw it. And then, of course, 2 years later, he sort of gathers together some of the things from the 10 o'clock in his wonderful little book, The Gentle Art of Making Enemies. Some of the wonderful sayings from that. I'm not arguing with you, I'm telling you. One cannot continually disappoint a continent. This is Whistler all over. You know, he is nothing but a larger than life character. There was no other character in Victorian England quite like this man. And then when a young female admirer comes up to him sometimes, she says, I know of only two painters in the world, and to Whistler, yourself and Velasquez. And then Whistler replies, why? Answered Whistler in dulcet tones. Why drag Velasquez into it? I mean, he believed himself. Whether he took himself that seriously, I don't know, but he certainly was an artist who was nothing if not self-confident. And of course, there was a cooling off between him and Wilde. But I like this thing that Wilde said about him shortly before Wilde's own downfall. And he says this of Whistler. He says, however, he was never dull. His brilliant wit, his caustic satire, and his amusing epigrams, or perhaps should we say epitaphs of his contemporaries, made his views on art as delightful as they were misleading, and as fascinating as they were unsound. Besides, he introduced humour into art criticism, and for that, if no other reason, he deserves to be affectionately remembered. Oscar Wilde. Well, as we know, in 1895, Wilde himself brought a suit against the Marquis of Queensberry, and Wilde was eventually convicted of gross indecency and sodomy on 25th of May, 1895, and he received 2 years hard labour. Now, Whistler, although by then he had broken with Wilde, he did feel that Wilde had been treated very harshly. Although he describes him as the indecent poet, he did point out the hypocrisy of both the circles of London and Paris, and in many ways both of them were larger than life figures of their era, and both of them, as we would describe, were both the most nattily dressed men about town of the whole period, and sparred with one another. And there's a nice little illustration of towards the end of his life by William Heinemann, after William Nicholson of Whistler in 1897. Whistler still paints these great portraits, by the way, even towards the end of his life. I would say there is something of a falling off in his late work. A lot of his time is spent on writing pamphlets and lectures, but he marries in 1888, the year of the 10 o'clock, and he marries Beatrice Whistler, and that is his Harmony in Red portrait of his wife. And he has the good fortune to meet the American industrialist and collector of Oriental art, Charles Lang Freer. Now, Charles Lang Freer sets up this wonderful museum in Washington of Oriental art, but he also is a great collector, and he befriends James McNeill Whistler. And one of the very best collections of Whistler's work within the whole world is in Washington at the Freer Art Gallery. And these are some of the photographs I have from there. There are many, many paintings there, including Freer's own portrait, but many, many paintings from the latter career of Whistler in the Freer Art Gallery. And it's beautifully set out according to the way that Whistler would have wanted his paintings to be displayed against the right colour backgrounds. Very, very important to Whistler, both the frame and the background and how an art is displayed. It was for him, he didn't like the Victorian method of stacking them up like they were in the Royal Academy. He preferred the Japanese way of having everything considered, all colours and the backgrounds to be considered, and equal spaces between paintings as well. So he was very modern in that way, was James McNeill Whistler. And we come towards the end of his life. That's a very last self-portrait there, brown and gold, 1895 to 1900. And often parallels have been drawn with Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray and James McNeill Whistler, not necessarily directly connected, but there are parallels within Wilde's work and of course and Whistler himself. And there's a very late drawing of Sir Robert Ponsonby Staples by Whistler in 1901. Now, Whistler is by 1900 and 1901 an ill man. He goes abroad in 1900, comes back to London, comes back to Cheyne Walk. He planned to meet patrons even on the day he died, and but he does die suddenly, and his passing is lamented just because of the character he was, really. He was going to be immortalized by a statue by Auguste Rodin. A maquette for it is in the Rodin Museum in Paris, 1908. So we're talking, he died in 1903, so we're talking 5 years after Rodin's death. Interestingly enough, the nude for this statue is in fact Gwen John, the sister of Augustus John. And but it was never completed, and that statue is not a part of James McNeill Whistler's grave, which is in the old churchyard at Chiswick, not that far away from Hogarth's grave. And this is the grave of James McNeill Whistler, which you can visit to this very day in Chiswick. And he remains one of these intriguing characters. And I hope this evening I've given you something of an idea about this extraordinary life, and an artist who was not afraid to be different, to be himself, and in a way set the scene for all Bohemian artists and all artists, modern artists who followed in his footsteps.